Thank you for joining us for these live internet studies. My name is Arl Ben Lyman Hanavi, and this is the first of two segments in the live internet studies. It's an hour and a half long, and the first segment is given over to a topic known as Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events, where we look at the end-time scenarios, and we're working our way through Matthew's Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24 with a view towards, as you can see on your screen, the book of Revelation. That's really what this study is about, but we've got to get the proper background and mine and glean and study all of the passages that work their way up to the book of Revelation, namely all those Old Testament prophecies, particular books of Daniel, providing us timings. Isaiah is a heavy player in this game. Jeremiah shows up a lot. Zechariah. Even the tiny book of Joel has a lot to say about end-time scenarios. And then when we work our way through Yeshua's discourse with his disciples in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and Luke 21, and then keep pushing through the New Testament into Paul's letters to the Thessalonians and even Peter's two small epistles there, and then finally turning to the book of John, that's when we begin to realize that when John was given this revelation by Yeshua at the exile on Patmos, that he was already working with this rich, vast wealth of apocalyptic genre, apocalyptic language that was already given way back. Like I said, it's going back to the book of Daniel and things like that. I mean, it actually goes even farther back. We could, if we wanted to push the case, we could go all the way back to Deuteronomy, things like that. But I'm glad that you've joined us. We left off last week where we took a look at a Christian pastor by the name of Thomas Ice, who gave an interpretation of Matthew 24 to 25, where there's this part in chapter 24 of Matthew that is a topic on this idea of who is taken and who is left. And when we look at that passage directly, let me turn to it so you can see. In Matthew 24, starting in verse 36, I'll just read that relevant part. I'll start back up for the context. But about that day and the hour no one knows. Yeshua's talking about his second return. He says, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. And we've already established the idea that there are two groups of people that exist in any given age, and there will be these two people, groups of people will be more pronounced in the final days as the last 7 years of history is fast approaching. And the reason it's pronounced is because we could say that there is this maturing of this harvest. And the harvest is the separation are between what Yeshua told us in Matthew 13 as the wheat, which are the righteous people, and the tares, which are the wicked people. And when we look at parables like that, the parable of the harvest, now we begin to get to this part of the Bible in Matthew where it talks about the day and the hour no one knows, not the angels of heaven nor the Son of Man, but the Father alone. The return of Yeshua will happen during the maturation of the wheat and the tares. Verse 37, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. And then Jesus himself gives us part of this description of the two people groups. For as in those days before the flood, who's the they? They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah into the ark, and they, who's the they, did not understand until the flood came and took them, who's the them, all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. So there are two people groups, the wheat and the tares, the righteous and the unrighteous. And in the days of the coming of the Son of Man, i.e. Yeshua, they will be just like the days of Noah, where we've got the general world at large, who is the they in this passage, who are the tares in the Matthew 13 parable of the wheat and the tares. And they, the world at large, are not paying attention to any of the signs or any of the indicators that summer is near, using Yeshua's own words, that the time of Jesus' return is fast approaching. And of course, why not? Because they don't believe in God. They don't believe in Jesus. They don't read the Word. They don't read the Bible. They don't care, and they're unaware. And so they, like the analogy given by Yeshua, picked up by Paul, carried on into Peter, is the thief in the night principle, that the world at large is like that thief in the night, is like that people who get their house broken into and they don't know when the thief is coming. But as we begin to realize in this passage that there are wheat along with tares. We who are believers are the wheat. And so we are likened to Noah, who entered the ark, and we were rescued from the judgment that is going to befall planet Earth. So within that context of the two people groups, and there's this larger context of during this time frame, are we talking about the rapture itself? Are we talking about judgment befalling earth? How is that we are to understand this? The Son of Man is returning. Is he returning in rapture? Or is he returning in retribution? Is he pouring out judgment and final wrath on the world? Well, we're working within that larger context, and so in that we've encountered these questions, and here it is, starting in verse 39. They didn't understand until starting in verse 40. At that time, so specifically, here's the question that we've been kind of entertaining on the table. At that time, Yeshua says there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. And then in verse 41, he gives a second analogy. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one will be left. And what we found is that this perfectly parallels the notes given to us in the parable with the wheat and the tares also, meaning in the parable with the wheat and the tares, when we start and look at verse 40, he says, so just as the weeds are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man, starting verse 41, I guess, the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and they will be thrown into the furnace of fire, and in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So in the first section that I've got highlighted on my screen from Matthew 13, the weeds sequentially are gathered first out of his kingdom, and they, the weeds, the wicked, are thrown into the furnace of fire, and in that place there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then in verse 43, it's then sequentially the righteous will shine forth like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. The one who has ears, let him hear. So based on that sequence, we looked at the notes from that particular pastor. Jump over to his page again. Mr. Thomas Ice, in his particular blog, which is found on blueletterbible.org, and his conclusion was twofold. One, when we asked the question, when is this time frame and who is taken and who is left? His answer to these questions, and you can go back and watch episode number 245 of my live internet shows to see the answer to his particular interpretation, which I'm summarizing for you tonight. Excuse me. His interpretation is of this time frame and who's taken and who's left is twofold. Number one, the time frame given in the Matthew passage that we just read a moment ago. Let me take it up here like that. Is the time frame of Yeshua's second coming, not the rapture, but the second coming. So he's just drawing a distinction between what he's calling the rapture and the second coming. And he puts the second coming at the very end of what is commonly called the 7-year tribulation. For familiarity's sake, I'm using that term 7-year tribulation, even though I don't personally hold to that concept of 7-year tribulation. But let me find a chart that shows you kind of what's going on. When we talk about 7-year tribulation, which we're going to turn headlong into in my next sections when we get to topic number 10, 9, 10, 11? Hang on real quick. Let me just look. Yeah, topic 10, 11, and 12, Rapture Views, making a case for pre-wrath, Rapture Views, final analysis. So we're going to jump into that sooner or later. But what we have is second coming is part of a time frame that's indicated on this particular slide at the far right of the slide. The second coming is at the end of the 7-year tribulation. The tribulation itself is taken up by this entire slice in the middle, known as God's wrath, and therefore, by comparison, when we look at rapture, it's at the far left of the chart, reading from left to right. Rapture happens at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation. It's known as pre-trib for most Christians, and it takes place pre-tribulation, meaning Christians will not go through the wrath of God, the tribulation, which is the entire 7 years on this slide. Instead, at the far right, Christians will come back with Christ at his second coming. So the first part of this gentleman's answer that we looked at, the Pastor Ice, he believes that this time frame here in Matthew right now is talking about the second coming, and therefore when it asks the questions who will be taken and who will be left, his answer is that the taken are those who are taken in judgment, and the left behind are those who are left behind to inherit the kingdom, which is the millennial kingdom, which will be ushered in. Using this slide, we can see it this way. We've got the 7 years written in green. We've got the pre-trib rapture, which would be on the farthest right. This isn't exactly what it looks like, but just as close enough. Let me see if I have a better slide. I apologize. There's that one. There's this. I'm just jumping through some slides. Maybe I should just park out on this for a second. Don't look at the farthest left of the screen now. Just look at the bright red part relatively in the middle where it says the tribulation. That's marked out as 7 years, broken up into 3.5, 3.5. Notice that the rapture with this arrow pointing up is the only arrow on the slide, on the top of the slide that's pointing up. It's right after the cross there that you can see. So it's labeled the rapture, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and the tribulation takes place after the rapture sequentially. And then if you keep your eyes moving from left to right, the right side of that square known as the tribulation, the red part, has an arrow pointing down which says second coming and Armageddon. So in the classic pre-trib, premillennial viewpoint, just like the pastor described, rapture takes place at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation, and therefore that's when we go up to meet Christ in the air and be with him. And therefore, in that sense, taken would be taken away in rapture. And left behind might be left behind as in left out of the rapture sequence. But since he believes that Matthew chapter 25, the verses that we're looking at, are referring to Jesus' second coming, where Jesus comes back down and we, the saints, come back down with him, then he believes that the taken are those who are going to be taken in judgment, like the Matthew 13 wheat and tares. Notice sequentially in that passage, the wheat are the tares are taken to be burned first sequentially, and then the whatever's left behind, the wheat are left to inherit the kingdom, which on this slide that you're looking at is the kingdom age. It's kind of a teal blue where it just says kingdom age 1,000 years. So that's his perspective in a nutshell, and we looked at that last week. What I want to do now real quick is finish up Pastor David Guzik's version of this same slice of Matthew 24, verse 40 to 44. We kind of have been kind of dancing around it, but I just want to finish this part and then jump straight into Tim Hagg's view on this same section, and where we're answering the question of kind of the larger context. When is this time frame? Is it rapture or is it second coming? And then within that larger kind of context, who is taken and who is left? So David Guzik, which he has a commentary found on his website at enduringword.com. I've put the link in the description of the video so you can follow that there below of my YouTube videos. He has Jesus cautions his disciples to be ready for an unexpected coming in section 3. And then we've got the relevant passage that I just read a moment ago, so I'm not going to read through that again. Let's just read his notes. Again, this was rehashing, so I'll read fairly quickly. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. According to Guzik, as we're going to see, he says, Jesus here points to curious disappearances, to a catching away of some at the coming of the Son of Man. Notice right away, Guzik says Jesus points to curious disappearances, to a catching away of some at when? The coming of the Son of Man, also described in 1 Thessalonians 4. So he's talking about catching away, right? That sounds like rapture language. And indeed, 1 Thessalonians 4 is the classic rapture passage. I'm purposely not just turning to it now because we're going to deal heavily with rapture when we get into the next few topics. So right now, we're just making ourselves aware of the fact that there's the rapture and then there's the second coming. But notice, Guzik gives an important clue that when we're looking at this topic, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament perspective, we have to remember that the Bible uses this term second coming as if it is synonymous with both rapture and second coming. If we were to try and get really nitpicky on the details of, is Jesus coming down to catch us and snatch us up to be with him, or is he coming, do we meet him in the air, and that's known as rapture, or is he coming back down to planet Earth to establish his kingdom? Is it one event? Is it two events? Is it one event with two kind of bookends? What gives? And we'll get to that in a moment, but just kind of whetting your appetite. So in that context, where David Guzik doesn't say exactly whether he thinks that this is rapture versus second coming, he just labels it second coming. But he does talk about the disappearance, which sounds like rapture language to me. He says, then, quoting France, taken is the same verb that's used elsewhere in Matthew, right? Chapter 1, chapter 17, chapter 18, and 20. And it implies what? To take someone to be with you, and therefore here points to the salvation rather than the destruction of the one being taken. So whether he's talking about rapture or second coming, he definitely takes, quoting France, that taken here refers to taken in salvation, which is the opposite view, at least on the verbiage, of what the other Pastor Ice believes. Remember, Pastor Ice believed that taken refers to the weeds and left behind refers to the wheat. But in other words, the taken is the unbelievers, taken in judgment, and left behind are the righteous to inherit the kingdom. But Guzik says no, taken using the verb para lambano, and we looked at this last week, so I'll just kind of show you real quick. In Matthew 24, when Jesus says, the flood came and took them all away, speaking of the flood in Noah's day, he uses a form of the Greek word here, airo, which means that you can see Strong's 142, to lift up, to raise up, which corresponds with the flood waters taking people away, lifting them up and washing them away, washing them off the scene. As the flood waters crashed down, the people were washed away from the location. They were taken in judgment. They were lifted up. They were raised up off the ground because of the water, the flood rising, which also consequently lifted up the ark that Noah was in. Comparatively, when he says in Matthew, two men were in the field, one will be taken, he uses a form of this Greek word, para lambano. We looked at Strong's number 3880 when we were looking through Pastor Ice's notes. And this doesn't mean to lift up or to carry away. It means to receive to oneself, to take from, to receive, to take with me. And it's broken up into two words. If I scroll down a little bit more, it's from para 3844, which means close or alongside of. We get our words paralegal, paramedic, parachurch, all have that same initial part of the word para, which means close to or alongside of, right? Paralegal, parachurch, para organization, paramedic. Para here in Greek, 3844, close alongside of, and you link that up with the Greek word 2983, lambano, which means to aggressively take. And so we have this meaning to aggressively take alongside of oneself. And that's what Guzik is kind of hinting at when he says that this particular word taken, para lambano, has to do with this idea of aggressively taking someone to themselves. And he sees that as an indicator that this must be Yeshua taking the believers to himself. And that's where the word taken comes in. Instead of just looking at the English where the flood took them all away, and then one is taken and one is left. And in the flood account, the taken are the wicked, and therefore that other pastor used that to indicate that he believes that taken are the wicked, and he's probably basing it on the Matthew 13 wheat and tares parable there. Moving on through Guzik, we see that he continues to say, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. Again, at this point in time, we're talking about, is this rapture or is this second coming? He says, since the day and hour of this coming are unknowable, Jesus' followers must be on constant guard for his coming. The language of Jesus returning at an hour when no one knows for his believers creates what most people believe to be a rapture scenario. Again, this sets up what Guzik kind of teases as a second coming dilemma. And here's the dilemma. And again, it's not truly a dilemma, but we're going to see how Guzik articulates what he's kind of suggesting in kind of jest as a humor. He gives these bullet points. He says, is Yeshua, speaking of Yeshua coming, is it at an unexpected hour, or is it positively predicted? And why would he ask that? Right? If Jesus clearly said that no one knows the day or the hour, why would there even be the possibility that it's predicted? And the reason he can say that is because when we go back to, let me pull up one of these slides again. When we go back to, I'm jumping through my slides. When we go back to, yes, this is a good enough slide. When we go back to Daniel's prophecies that span through Daniel's book, going all the way back to Daniel chapter 2 with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, fast forwarding to chapter 7 with Daniel's own dream, then chapter 9 with more details of the same slice of prophecy and history, and then moving from chapter 9, just finishing out the rest of the book, 10, 11, 12, 9, 10, 11, and 12, and then the book ends. So using Daniel's prophecies of the 70 weeks and all of the details with the coming lawless one, the coming little horn, the coming Antichrist, and all of the details surrounding the Gentile nations that would suppress Israel, and giving us this slice of history that fills in details about Israel's judgment and redemption and the Gentiles and things like that. We have to remember that Daniel was given a lot of details, and within the 70 weeks, he not only is given details, but if you go back and read carefully through, starting with, say, with chapter 7 and then jump over to chapter 9 and then finish the book, you'll find that you're going to be given days of, let me use this slide now. You're going to be given days that are marked out from the midpoint of Daniel's 70th week, which is called by Christians the 7-year tribulation. This 70th week is marked out by from the midpoint of the week when Antichrist is already on the scene because he made a covenant with Israel earlier on, 3.5 years into it. At the midpoint, at the 3.5 year mark, something significant happens. Daniel describes it as this breaking of the covenant at the midpoint. He also describes it as the time when there's going to be this persecution of the saints, the wearing out of the saints, and that this Antichrist is actually given 42 months, or a time times and half a time, as it's described earlier in Daniel, right, in Daniel 7 and 9. And then when you keep reading through 10, 11, and 12 of Daniel, you find that the angel who's relaying this information to Daniel tells him that from the timing of the abomination of desolation, which is the midpoint, there will be 1,260 days for the rule of the prince. And the prince in this context is not Jesus, but it's instead the false prince, the Antichrist, right? The false Christ, the one who comes in place of Christ, who is a pretender of Christ and is opposed to Christ, right? Which is what his name Antichrist entails. So from that time, we've got the rule of the prince being only 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days. I'll show you another chart here in a moment that pulls in the book of Revelation using the same time frame to, in fact, I'll just show it to you now since we're talking about the 1,260 days. There we go. 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days, or a time, and half a times shows up prominently in the book of Revelation 5 different times, and each time it unmistakably refers to the second half of the 7-year tribulation, or the 70th week of Daniel, and it's describing the reign of Antichrist when there's going to be what we might today call the New World Order in view. The 8th beast empire will be raging. We will have a time of unparalleled persecution of Jews and Christians and anyone else who refuses to take the mark of the beast. And yet at the same time, the Antichrist will be imposing his own mark and setting up his statue and enforcing worldwide worship of himself. The false prophet will be on the scene as well. So we've got 42 months is described in Revelation 11. 1,260 days shows up also in Revelation 11 with the 2 witnesses who will be here during that time. 1,260 days language shows up in Revelation 12, where the woman flees into the wilderness to escape the persecution of Antichrist. And to some measure, she has spared a lot of that persecution. And we're going somewhere with this little side rabbit, so don't lose sight of the fact that we're talking about, is this Yeshua's rapture or Yeshua's second coming, and who is taken and who is left? We're in this 3.5 year slice when we could be looking at rapture, which of course would disrupt the whole picture if we're talking about a pre-trib rapture. But if we're not talking about pre-trib, then this kind of fits with the language. Time, times, and half a time shows up in Revelation 12 also, where the woman is given 2 wings to fly into the desert to flee from the serpent who's trying to destroy her, which in Revelation 12 is Satan incarnate, the Antichrist. So time, times, and half a time. And then 42 months language shows up in the next chapter of Revelation, chapter 13, where it's talking about, and here's the part that I'm really honing in on. The beast, who is the Antichrist, is given authority to exercise this persecution, this authority on earth for about 42 months. He makes war on the saints and to try and conquer them.